Several of the world's largest economies are now in recession. So we have to start asking the question, could 2024 be worse than 2008? I'm going to explain this to you in 3 simple, fast steps. Step number 1, let's go over this global recession that we're likely entering, or maybe we've already entered. Now, I know a lot of you right about now are saying, George, what are you talking about? The stock market is at all-time highs. The unemployment rate here in the United States is almost at all-time lows. Okay, fair point. We're going to get to that in just a moment. But before we do, let's take a look at how the global economy works. I want to point out initially that the global economy is very interconnected. All right, we've got the United States right here. We have the UK, Germany, China, Japan. Okay, well, right now, Germany is in recession. In fact, the whole Eurozone is most likely headed for recession. We've got China that is reporting outright deflation, the worst deflation they have had in decades. Now, officially, they're not in recession yet, but tell me how a modern day economy can have quarter after quarter of deflation and not eventually go into an economic contraction. Japan, they're in recession. The UK, they're in recession. But the United States, our economy is booming? Well, how does that work? First of all, editor, go ahead and throw up a chart. We have to recognize that the 4 main economies for manufacturing would be China at 28%, United States at 16%, Japan 7%, Germany 5%. Now, these statistics are from 2018. But the percentages might change slightly, but the 4 major players are still going to be the same. So let's think through how this works. China exporting goods to Japan, Japan exporting goods to China, China exporting goods to Germany, and Germany doing the exact same thing. And even with the United States, we produce way less than we consume. We still export a lot. So it's a similar type of relationship where China exporting a lot of goods to the United States, but we're exporting goods to China, UK. It's all interconnected. So what happens is if Germany, China, Japan, UK go into a recession, well, that's going to impact the demand for all of the people that we're exporting to. That means our exports go down. So what likely happens to our GDP? 70% of our economy is consumption. So if we don't have demand outside of the United States, then we'll just consume all of that extra stuff right here in the good old US of A. Okay, well, that really doesn't make a lot of sense because what we have to realize is that all the stuff that we are exporting is a surplus. In other words, there's not enough demand for that stuff in the United States of America. Let me give you a specific example. We export a lot of food. Let's just say corn and poultry and chicken. So I don't know that anyone would argue that Americans can eat more than they already do. I think they eat plenty as it is. So if we didn't have these customers, let's say in China, buying our chicken and buying our corn, could we just sell that right into the United States at the exact same price? No. We might be able to get rid of it, but we'd have to reduce the price, decrease margins. If we decrease the price, what does that do to nominal GDP? Brings it down. But that's not all. Let's look at it from the flip side of the coin. Like we said earlier, the United States does export a lot, but we import way more, which is why we have these massive trade deficits. Okay, well, if Germany is going into recession, China depression, all of this economic activity is decreasing. What that means is there's probably going to be a lot of entities that will go bust. A lot of those entities are providing goods, the goods that we consume here in the US. Obviously, New York is an extreme example, and I'm not saying that if the economies of Germany, China, and Japan continue to go downhill, more of their businesses go bust, that we'll have some sort of Mad Max situation here in the United States. It'll happen to a much lesser degree, but the concept still remains. That if we have less stuff for us to buy in the United States, it is true, prices may go a lot higher, but economic activity will definitely slow down. All you have to do is just look at the S&P 500, for heaven's sakes. Look at the unemployment rate here in the US. It's impossible for us to go into a recession right now. The economy is booming, for heaven's sakes. Okay, fine. Valid point. Let's go ahead and throw up a chart of the Nikkei in Japan, the stock market. It's at all-time highs. And let's look at the unemployment rate, under 3%. But they are, in fact, in a recession. And that's not all. Let's look at the stock market in Germany, all-time highs. Let's look at the stock market in the UK, all-time highs. Let's look at the German unemployment rate. Creeped up lately, but it's very, very low, relatively speaking. And the UK unemployment rate, also very, very low. So all of these economies have stock markets at all-time highs. They all have extremely low unemployment, and they are all officially in recession. So I don't think that's a valid argument for the United States avoiding an economic slowdown, let alone our economy being on fire, running on all 8 cylinders. So the bottom line, to put it in very simple terms, is if we look at what's happening outside of the United States, it's a global recession. Let's just call a spade a spade. And the probability of the United States avoiding that is extremely low. Step number 2. So we know the global economy is very interconnected, but what about the banks in the global economy? Remember, we've got Chinese banks, German, Japanese, United States, UK. They all have banks that are also connected to one another, just like the economies. In fact, I would argue they're probably even more connected. Let's remember that back in 2008, we had the GFC. But what did the G stand for? You all know this. Global financial crisis. It wasn't a financial crisis, it was a global financial crisis. But why? Because I left the boom there, not to represent an economic boom, but our financial system going boom. Basically blowing up. Why? Because of the real estate market crashing. So the real estate market crashing impacts the United States banks, which impacted the banks in the UK, Germany, China, Japan. In other words, the banks in the euro dollar system that turned a real estate crash into a global financial crisis. And I would argue today the dynamics that were at play within the monetary system are even more extreme than they were in 2008. Step number 3, to determine if 2024 could be worse than 2008, we have to ask ourselves what is different about today than 2008. Or maybe we should go back even a little further and say 2007. Here's what I'm referring to. I think you now realize how important, crucial treasuries are to the global monetary system. In fact, I think we could go so far as to say that they're not just crucial, they're absolutely mandatory. They're basically the oil in an engine. If you take out that oil, the engine is going to seize up. It's going to freeze. It's not going to work. So we've got Bank A, Bank B, Bank C, and we have to remember that these banks could be geographically located anywhere. It doesn't really matter. They all just make up this very interconnected network. So Bank A could be in China, Bank B could be in Singapore, Bank C, the Bahamas, or the Cayman Islands, or even in the United States. But they all run on the same oil because it's all the same system. It's all the same network. So let's assume for a moment that we do have a global recession. That's your base case. All right, what's going to happen to the risk within the banking system? That's going to go up. Well, in that case, what's going to happen for demand for the collateral? In other words, demand for the treasuries. Well, that's going to go up as well. But prior to the GFC, what was the typical response mechanism for the central banks? I mean, go back to the recession that we had in the early 90s, the recession that we had during the dot-com bust. What did the Fed do? Pretty much nothing other than drop rates. In terms of going out in the marketplace and buying treasuries by creating bank reserves, in other words, QE, they hadn't yet put that tool in their toolbox. But now, obviously, that is their default. So whenever we have a little hiccup, they go straight to the QE. That's why we've seen QE 1, 2, 3, 4, pretty much infinity. Even though they're doing QT now, the Fed's balance sheet, or at least the level of bank reserves, is around 3.5 trillion, where in 2007, it was 40 billion with a B. So even if it's come down a little lately, it's still way, way higher. So no one here would argue that if we go into another crisis that looks like 2008, that the Fed won't do QE. I think we can all agree that that's going to be the very first thing they do. All right, well, let's think that through. If the Fed does quantitative easing, what they're doing is they're taking all of these treasuries out of the monetary system, which actually needs more treasuries because the amount of risk is increasing, and they park them on their balance sheet. One of the foremost experts on this system is a gentleman by the name of Manmohan Singh with the IMF, and he calls this siloing of collateral. Now you could be saying to yourself, okay, George, but yeah, they're creating these bank reserves. Well, that doesn't really help the banks out here. Why? Because they don't have access to the Fed's balance sheet. They don't have access to those bank reserves. So there's a very strong argument that while the banks that do have access to these reserves or the Fed's balance sheet do have some sort of benefit, this system as a whole has a net negative because these treasuries were useful or more useful, not just to the banks that don't have access to the Fed's balance sheet, but even for the banks that do have access to the Fed's balance sheet. Why? Because they are connected to the entire network. Now, let me be very clear. I am not saying that the Fed coming out and bailing out a bank in the United States system by creating more bank reserves and taking assets off their balance sheet doesn't help that bank. It absolutely does. And it might be able to prevent a complete collapse of the system. But we have to look at the trade-offs. Like Thomas Sowell says, there are no solutions, there are only trade-offs. So by taking collateral or oil out of the system, you're just replacing it with something that over the long term is going to be less effective. And if it's less effective for the banking system, the global monetary system, that's going to increase risk, which is going to make the recession a lot worse. Why? Because of that circular relationship that we discussed earlier between the real economy and the monetary system. You cannot have a collapse of the monetary system without a collapse in global economic output. And you can't have a collapse in global economic output without having a collapse in the global monetary system. So is the next crisis, regardless of what year it falls in, going to be worse than 2008? Well, there are no certainties, there are only probabilities. I can't tell you what's going to happen in the future. None of us know. But what this video should make very clear is the amount of risks we have in the system. The amount of potential problems we have is definitely greater today.